Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Gina Nutt and Elissa Washuta for a discussion of their latest books, Night Rooms and White Magic, moderated by KIRSTEN Reach. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copies of Night Rooms and White Magic. If you already have copies of the books or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please do note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Thank you, Zoom, for increasing your accessibility. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked CC Live Transcript on your display and click through the options. And lastly, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Gina Nutt is the author of the poetry collection Wilderness Champion and the chapbooks Here Is My Adventure, I Call It Alone, and Ars Herzogica. She is a graduate of Syracuse University's MFA program in creative writing, and her writing has been published in online and print venues, including Cosmonauts Avenue, Joyland, Ninth Letter, Salt Hill, The Best of the Net Anthology, and elsewhere. Elissa Washuta is the author of the previous books Starvation Mode and My Body is a Book of Rules, named a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. With Teresa Warburton, she is co-editor of the anthology Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers, and is an assistant professor of creative writing at The Ohio State University. Today, they are joined by moderator KIRSTEN Reach, fiction editor at the Kenyon Review. Before joining the review, she was an editor at Melville House, Grand Central Publishing, and Henry Holt & Company, where she worked with award-winning authors, including Lynn Truss, Philip Hoare, and Hilary Mantel. This evening, they'll be discussing Gina and Elissa's latest books, Night Room and White Magic, two curious and captivating essay collections that meditate on some of the most iconic artifacts of our material culture, from horror movies to quartz crystals to Stevie Nicks, asking how these images and objects can both guide our understandings of ourselves, as well as show us what has been taken. In Night Rooms, Gina Nutt weaves together fragmented images from horror films to conjure the specters of anxiety and depression, body image, grief, survival, and the myriad of ways dark cultural ephemera mirror our most intimate experiences. In White Magic, Elissa Washuta unearths the real spirits and magic of her native ancestors, coming into her own craft amid a culture that has endeavored to repackage what has been erased through cheap facsimiles, mass-produced artifacts, and whitewashed mysticism. Writing in Shelf Awareness, Julia Kastner calls Night Rooms an experience that is sensory, intellectual, and emotional, illuminating difficult and even uncomfortable truths, an observation that perfectly describes the reading of both of these brilliant books. We're so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Gina, Elissa, and KIRSTEN.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, it's so good to be here with you both. Thank you for doing this. And thank you so much to Ben and to Audrey at Harvard Bookstore and to Eric Obenov and Brett and Eliza for making all of this happen. I love having conversations with authors about work, but especially work as brilliant as both of yours. I can't believe how good these books are. They're so wonderful, and I think there's a lot of overlap between them. So I'm going to start off with some really hard, big questions that I've already warned you about, and then I'll let you talk more about the synchronicities and the overlap between these two works, because I really want you both to be able to have that conversation here. Um, this is not a softball, but I thought we could start off by talking about death. I think it's a really important jumping off point for both of you in talking about survival throughout your work. Elissa, in your previous books, but also in these essays, Gina, I think you hit on a lot of the same notes of body image and suicide and really hard stuff and living through the worst moments of your life by something as simple as sitting on your porch and watching different cars go by with different colors of cars and trying to figure out what that means for you and how you're going to move forward from this moment. And both of you start these books with really high stakes because you're talking about, you're speaking from a space where you're trying to work your way out. You're essaying toward something else. So I was starting here by talking about rebirth, death as a starting place for you in this work, even if you didn't start with it in your original draft. Can you just speak to that topic, either one of you?
Yeah, I really didn't. It was not a starting place for me, but I think it was something. There was like this sort of hole filled with death that did not. I didn't want to look at this place in my memory. Um, I wanted to think that like after the end point of My Body is a Book of Rules, I like to tell myself like after that everything got better and my life was much better. I figured everything out, but of course I didn't. Things got worse even. Um, and so I think that death is in like all throughout this book in a bunch of ways, and one of them is that like it's the product of really coming to coming to let myself accept that men could have killed me, and it was something that I was in a lot of denial about. And just told myself I was in situations that weren't that bad or whatever. um and I think like writing this book was an exercise in not an exercise in but like it was the product of realizing like I've been in some real danger and I will be again. Like this whole world is a very dangerous place for me to be. Um and and I think that like really realizing that made me write the book that I did, where there was like nothing I saved for for the next book or whatever. I didn't try to limit the scope. I thought like I finally felt like I really enjoyed being alive and had for like a long time. By the time I got started writing this book, I'd learned how to be really happy in this world and really happy with being alive, and also afraid that like it'll end at some point. Hopefully not too soon, but if it does, I wanted to make sure like it really was living in the moment. Like every single thing in my life is in this book. It's like it's a big it's a big book full of all my stuff, and I think um that's because of the specter of death, and really realizing that it's coming at some point, hopefully not too soon. I made even more of a downer talking about death.
I don't think so. Oh, I don't think you're a downer talking about death. I had, I think, sort of the opposite experience where death was what brought me to the book. I felt in a sense almost like I was at a time in my life where I was really obsessing about it. It was all I was thinking about. And what I'd been writing before, which were these kind of playful poems, which I think alluded to death or some of the things that this book addresses, but in perhaps a playful voice or with more animals or things like that. I was kind of masking or hiding behind these kind of parables, which is fine, but it wasn't really working for me. Like I wasn't feeling fulfilled while I was writing in the mornings. And so I said, well, I'm going to just write about death because it's what I'm thinking about. And so I ended up really just leaning into that, and kind of following off the page and on the page, like my own encounters with death, my own, coming up against grief from family members who've chosen suicide, finally trying to figure out my own mental health situation, figure out what I could do to live happier in the world. And now it's almost like maybe I'm at a better place with that. Perhaps not necessarily just from writing the book, because it took me dark for a while. And I think you have to wade through a lot, off and on the page. But I think, now I'm at a place where like it doesn't frighten me to be sad anymore. I think initially like it was something to fear or feel kind of like it was following me or stuck to me in a sense. And I feel like it's still true, but I feel less bad about it, if that makes any sense.
That
through
sounds so
writing.
similar to like the way I eventually felt about it. That I felt like, like I was stuck in these cycles that were like really dangerous and harmful for me and could get worse. And I felt like I was stuck until I, and like, I was cursed or something. And the book really felt like a practical way out. Like I felt like something in my gut was telling me that if I finished the book to my satisfaction, I would end the cycles. And I did. Yeah.
It feels in some ways, I had this sense when I was reading White Magic that it feels almost like, I would say there's a genre of books that like I characterize as writing to stay alive. Like this idea of story as a way to not only articulate an experience or talk yourself out of a feeling, or maybe even talk yourself deeper into it to pull through it. But that was something that really resonated with me, was this idea of story. But at the same time too, I was really interested in the way that you nod to that stories and magic can be real, they can be fake. That both things can be true. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'm wondering what prompted that exploration, being able to hold this duality of magic being real and also fake, and story being real, but also this imposed human narrative. Or is this something that came up while you worked?
It came up while I was working, because I was working on this book for a long time, just not knowing what it was about. And I mean, similar to what you were saying about your process, and like I was writing about all these things I wasn't interested in. And then I realized I just wanted to write about my ex-boyfriend, because he was the person I thought about all the time. And I was like always checking for his texts and whatever, and looking at his Instagram stuff or whatever. And and I was obsessed with, I knew that I was not only obsessed with him, I was obsessed with the idea of the truth and being duped. And like, I knew that that's what hurt so much about that breakup, was like feeling like I had been lied to and tricked by, this like magician figure. And I think, I wanted to find something real there, because I wanted that relationship to be, to start up again, but also because I wanted it to have been real. And my therapist in Seattle said something to me that I think carried with me into writing this book, which was that like we did a lot of, there wasn't any one thing she said, I don't think, but we did a lot of work together on my like refusal to believe that anything real could be in a place where there were lies. And and I really thought about that, like if someone is lying to me, is it all lies? Is it all fake? Like, is it all just a trick narrative? And I think that was like really my narrative question, that eventually I was interested in that. And at the same time, I was really interested in like the figure of the magician, and like the word magic, how it, can refer to witchcraft or whatever. It can refer to stage magic, which I find actually a lot more interesting now. And yeah, and I think like the book Here is Real Magic by Nate Staniforth was really useful in getting me thinking about that idea of the real in like the trickery of stage magic too, or he does close-up magic and stage magic.
Can I hear from both of you about what kind of tricks you wanted to pull in your work? You know, you're working with all this raw material, and I'm glad we started in this place. Thank you for letting me start in a dark place, because I feel like when we're talking about survival, it's good to just knock out the dark stuff right away so we can talk about how to live and how to enjoy it. Can you talk about what you wanted to do structurally? Because both of your works are very fragmentary and are also taking a lot of risks that are really, I think, are fascinating and impressive. So I wondered if you would talk about the way that you envisioned that, or how you played around with it, and how it started to feel right as you were piecing the book together. Do you want to start, Gina?
Sure, yeah. So, so initially, I think I had this very, I was a little too fragmentary, a little too out there. Like I was writing across the page. It was just kind of a mess. And so I kind of went back to prose poetry and was like, we're just writing one prose poem after another. And I began following just this idea of alternating descriptions of movie scenes with experiences from my life. And so kind of braiding those. And then I just started pulling in other ephemera that interested me. So taxidermy was something that I've always found fascinating and interesting, especially the Victorian, the anthropomorphic taxidermy from the Victorian era, like these little animals at school desks. Or I write about one tableau, it's called The Kittens Wedding, where there are a bunch of kittens dressed up for a wedding. And I was able to actually go visit a display of that. So it became, I think, in a sense, this, I envisioned this curated cabinet where I just had these experiences from my life intertwined with movies and other cultural ephemera that just seemed like part of my life, part of my mental Rolodex of inspiration and interest, like things that just stuck to me or that I felt stuck to in some way. And it also was kind of an interesting place to come to it from death and say, okay, well, why would I be interested in taxidermy if I love cats or if I love animals? Or why would I be interested in horror movies if death and, you know, danger has been part of my life? So that was part of that investigation. And I think being able to spend time and simmer in it, I don't know, I think it was something that I was happy to marinate in for several years and just kind of let breathe and expand, and just cycle through again and again, moving pieces around a lot of the time and trying to figure out what fit where, especially when you're working in those small fragments. That was a really big part of the work I did.
I love that you talk about cabinets, because that's how I think about it too. And also, just as an aside, Gina, I love the way your segments and your fragments are so fully formed and like they have like a sense of completeness that does make each one like a little figurine or something, and like it's a whole object in this cabinet. And I just love the idea of like book as display cabinet for everything that needs to go into this narrative. I also made the aside because I can't remember the question. It was about structure, right?
Well, I also want to hear about tricks, Elissa.
Tricks.
Tell me about gaining the power over your manuscript and also trying to pull things and if they worked.
I gotta look at the table of contents. What's in this book? You know, I think there like the process of writing the book was a process of working with these two kinds of magic. So there's the kind of magic that is like, you know, craft, the way we use these tricks to, you know, to evoke or whatever, to create impressions, to, you know, whatever. I mean, I think that's like magician stuff somewhat. And there's also the kind of magic that is like real. And I had never really let that in very much before into my process the way I have now with white magic and after. Just like just, you know, doing what I was doing in the time that I was writing about, like turning it over to the universe. Like I could say that a million times, like I'm turning it over to the universe, but I never was really, until I got to a point in the book where I was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know what I'm doing, but maybe I can make a project out of just watching Twin Peaks and taking notes on it, and just let's see where all this goes. And, you know, so I started in 2017 after I got here. I just started on this essay about the video I watched in the DARE program as a child that I couldn't stop thinking about, and then just kept going and going, and followed the associations that my research took me through, like where my curiosity went, and just trusted that something was going to turn up and that the book was going to be about something. I had to finally trust that I know how to write a book, which I did not. I suspected that I might not for several years. But that's what they were paying me to do at Ohio State. So I had to trust that I knew how to do it. And so that was the real magic for me. It's just like seeing the synchronicities and stuff that came up, like in the writing process. That still happens. It happens even more now post white magic. Like it's wild. It's completely wild what I, you know, like put into motion. So that was the real magic. But the trick, I think, was, you know, so I went to a magic conference and learned about how magicians do their tricks, sort of. And mostly I remember the concepts and like just the idea of misdirection, like has so many components, like the physical components of, you know, like the hand you're waving so that the person is not looking at the other hand where you're palming something or whatever. But there's also like this, you know, this psychological misdirection. There's all these different layers of misdirection, and narrative is used in that process. And that's why like Nate Staniforth's work was really influential to me in making this book. And I wrote about, and I used some quotes from that book. You know, like the power of narrative to function as a magic trick and to drive actual magic tricks was really fascinating to me. So I you know, I decided that I was going to write this book that was going to, you know, have some things as like the central topics that might annoy people or whatever. Like, you know, writing a book about a breakup, you know, I knew that that might be annoying for some people, and like having my epigraphs repeat over and over, and having footnotes and all of this, you know, formal stuff. I think I used a lot of forms of misdirection to, you know, to present the book as being about one thing. You know, it's about cultural appropriation until it's not, until it's about a breakup, and then it's about whatever the book is about, colonization. But there's something else entirely that it's about at the same time that's happening the whole time. And I don't know exactly what that is, how to talk about what that is, but I think in the end it's just about forces, you know, like power, like an indescribable power. And that was, I think, the magic that I wanted to come out in the end was like the fact that all of this had been happening this whole time. But I was, you know, the reader may not have been looking over there where that was happening.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to something that was said earlier, but I want to talk to you about writing about TV and movies and these other inspirations that have made their way into your work. Elissa, obviously, your book is so much about Twin Peaks, and Gina, you have so many different references to different horror movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I was impressed that so many of them happened during proms and holidays. I just hadn't put that together until you were putting this list together when these awful events happen in a movie. But you ask, do I find the movies or do they find me? I'm making a lineage of what lingers. And I wondered if you'd both talk about that. Did the movies find you?
So I did follow the impulse like to write about. So I write each morning, and when I was working on this book, I followed the impulse to write from memory as much as possible. And so when I was thinking of, sometimes it was writing about a particular experience in my life and then pulling in films that, you know, would occur to me while I was doing that draft work. Sometimes it was writing and describing a scene from a movie or latching onto a particular line of dialogue. I have a really scary memory where I just remember, and maybe it's annoying sometimes, where I can like recite some movies like just from heart. But just writing to those lines and what they mean, and not just for my life, but I guess some of the larger cultural significance of some of the lines that I think echo from horror films. I'm thinking initially of the movie It Follows. There were definitely some which I eventually cut from the movie Revenge. And they just really had this like bone deep like resonance for me, where they felt much larger. And so I wanted to just sit and meditate with those, and just see where it went. I'm really glad, Elissa, that you mentioned frustration, because I think when you're at a place of frustration with the work, it kind of frees you up to just let it be what it wants to be and to follow it wherever it's going. For me, that's when my work gets really wild. But I think it was once I was in the book, it ended up being kind of a push and pull, where because I watched so many horror movies, it would be a matter of like, oh, okay, well, I want to write about that one. In the end, a lot of the movies that I wrote about while I was working on the book, like movies that I saw for the first time while I was writing the book, I ended up cutting a lot of those because the connection just didn't seem as deep. It didn't seem as long standing. Like it didn't feel as remembered for me. So I liked to keep those movies that really just had stuck with me for a long time. Even some, like, I think I write a bit about not having seen The Exorcist, and my sister recalling watching The Exorcist, and just like the feeling of someone describing a movie to you, especially a horror film, can have this deep meaning. Like it can have this sense of this forbidden thing you're not supposed to look at. So it was interesting to sit with these movies that had been in my life, even in their absence for so long, or I'd seen them so long ago and they still stay with me. And then having to rewatch everything to fact check was real fun.
Right. I was just going to ask, if you have an incredible memory, but you're remembering a lot of movies and trying to stick with your memory, was the fact checking difficult? Did you learn a lot that you had misremembered, or?
There were a few things where I was like, oh, okay, I guess I misremembered that. But there was one instance where I actually made that I made it part of the essay. I say, I remembered a scene as not including any animals, or a whole film not including any animals. And I nod to that and just say, as I remember it, because, and we talked about this a little earlier, just a flash of it, but memory can be tricky. And that's one way out of it, when you can't remember, or when you just want to drive that point home, like, well, as I remember it, there weren't any animals and men were supposed to be hunting in this movie. And that seemed resonant in the essay I was writing. So I left it instead of taking it and made it something. Those moments that like are inaccurate or annoying, sometimes the answer is to amplify them or play with it and, show a reader that that's possible.
Yeah, I had one of those moments in my book where I had misremembered a scene from Alice in Wonderland, and I just kept it like and remarked about it. Because I agree. I think like there's something really interesting about the the retelling of a movie scene, like trying to explain a movie scene to somebody else, and the way we place these, I don't know, the way we place the film scenes into our memories, and also the way, I don't know, I'm getting tripped up on my thoughts, but yeah, I found that approaching movies and TV as subject matter was really, it felt really daunting for me at first, because it's just really hard for me to convey all that, like to put a language to visuals. And when I first started doing it, I was just writing way too much and had to, had to cut down. And I think it was useful for me to realize, like, I just need to, you know, I just need to like do the cartoon sketch of what's in this scene, like the very basics, so that people get it. That like the movie is not what's important. What's important is why I put it, why I want to talk about it. Like the reason that it is part of this narrative for me is the narrative. So, I think that it, for me, it happens as a function of the fact that, I can't turn my working brain off. I can't relax. I can't, you know, like for any significant amount of time. And so if I'm watching a movie or now playing video games, I'm always, some part of my mind is always trying to make them fit into a narrative. And I think that makes it like exciting. There's like something dynamic about, I get really bored just watching movies, when I don't have anything to do. And I think it gives my brain something to do, to try to like fit parts of the plot points into a story I want to tell, like a little puzzle. I think makes it more fun for me.
Are you playing a new game right now, Elissa? Or are you still playing the ones that appear in your book?
No, I've played a lot of games since. The one I'm playing right now is Grand Theft Auto 5, which, like, weirdly enough, has so many, I'm writing an essay about it because, like, there are so many points of connection with the thing I've been working on that it is far more uncanny than anything in this book, like the connections that came up. So I'm playing through it a second time so I can write down the quotes.
Awesome. Gina, have you seen anything recently that's starting to make its way into your work?
Not that's starting to make its way into my work. It's interesting, like this is kind of circling back to talking about tricks. But I feel in some ways like I set out to, once I leaned into the idea of weaving, these experiences and horror movies, now I'm like running very far away from writing about movies or I've been home, this whole last year and watching lots of movies. So it's really strange, and it's really strange now, coming to the end of this book tour, and this book is out in the world, and it's kind of something I did for several, however many years. So it does feel odd to not be writing about movies or TV, or I have to find something new. I have to find new tricks, right? that's the fun part, I guess. It's a little daunting, it's a little scary, but I think too it's really cool. Like, it's not you have to find new tricks, it's you get to find new tricks. That's what I keep trying to say, like maybe that's trying to cast it into shiny a light, but I loved the movie Honeydew. Some really weird food stuff, some really weird just on a farm, just strange house stuff. Yeah, that was a good one. So not writing about it, but
This is not about tricks, but I feel like both of you were trying to excise something in letting this book into the world. Your books have very different journeys, but I do think there's something you were working toward and working through and trying to let go of. But I also feel like something is coming back to you with these books. Can you talk just a little bit about, Elissa, you mentioned magic coming back to you with this book, which I'm not surprised by at all, but can you speak just a little bit to your book's life and life in the world and what's come back your way that you weren't expecting?
With the book being published?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, gosh, it's a little hard to say because I feel like I'm in sort of a haze with the book coming out. And I think one thing that has been really amazing is that I felt for a long time working on this that that there were some experiments in the book that were not going to work out at all. And I think I had my first surprise when you read it and some other friends read it when it was in earlier manuscript form, and and like understood and appreciated what I was trying to do, and it came through. And now just to hear from so many people who like it works for is really astounding. I didn't think that some of these things were even going to make it into another revision once an editor got to it. Like, I just thought so many of the things that were weird were going to have to go, but those are the parts that seem to fascinate people the most. And it's just really nice. I think it's been so affirming and amazing to know that I was right to stick with my vision all along. And it was hard to write this book because I didn't want to. I wanted to do something that was easier. And like easier to sell, not easier for me to write, but like easier to find an audience for, like, and to whatever. But it didn't work. And so I just kept writing this book and eventually got to it. And I feel like it feels so good to know that, the patience that I was working on, like, paid off. I'm really happy with what came out. And it's just nice to, like, one thing that I had been waiting for was for, like, to be able to explain to people like what it's like to have all these synchronicities happening all the time. It's hard to just explain it to people that, like, there's a magician with the same name as my ex-boyfriend. It's like, oh yeah, that's pretty weird. But like, I wanted to make this book an explanation that really could make people feel the way I felt about it. And now everybody knows we're all on the same page about my synchronicities. And I just feel like it felt like kind of like lonely for a while to be like, all this stuff, I'm noticing all of these things connecting in my research and in the world and whatever. And now I get to share them with people, and that's really exciting.
That's great.
I love that your synchronicities are really exciting for you. I mean, other things too, but like especially your synchronicities, because one thing that I was experiencing while reading your book was that it's one of those books where when I recommend it to people, it's like you're excited for them to experience it. And I'm almost sad that like I won't have that experience of like the first experience of going through it again. You can't replicate the first time you read a book, right? Like I feel this way about like Mary Robison's Why Did I Ever? Like I'll never get back that first reading experience ever. But that was one of the most pleasing things, was like seeing those synchronicities and the like totally on point circularity that just like when everything starts clicking into place, it's so perfect. So as a reader, like I was like, how is this happening? But I'm right there with you with, feeling like there's almost like a sense of like validation, or a sense of like all that time, the frustration, not knowing if following your strange idea, it's just a different way of writing things, or writing the thing that might not be so easy to sell. I think that's really that's really hard to do. Like to just follow something and say, I'm going to write this anyway and see what happens. Like, even if it's not easy to sell, or I think in my case, like my biggest fear was like, just nothing will happen. Cause I've had that happen where I've written books and I just lose interest, or nothing happens. And that's always a possibility, I think, that something will just not work out. I think that's been my experience, or what surprised me is that like just sticking with it and taking it and making it as wild as possible, or really pursuing your interests, like, and following any little path or possibility, like how that actually does work and it can actually pay off. I
Was
don't,
there a moment for you? I'm sorry to interrupt.
oh
Was there a
no,
moment for you specifically in this book where you realized this is the one I'm sticking with? I'm not giving up. I'm not setting this aside.
man.
It's okay if there wasn't.
Yeah, I don't think there was. I think it was just one of those things where I was like, because I toggled between, I mean, I spent about, it was only 4 or 5 years, but I was toggling between, you know, I'd work on this, I'd work on a poetry manuscript, I'd work on this, I'd work on a poetry manuscript. And I think that it wasn't that I didn't want to be working on this one. I think it was just like when I became frustrated, I don't know, maybe that's a sign you love something, when you put it in a drawer and then come back to it. When you come back to it, that's when you know you love it. When you put it in the drawer, you have to kind of just like it just a little, to forget about it for a little bit. But maybe it was those moments when I was like, okay, this is worth coming back to. I mean, I think the strangest thing I did while working on the book was I had a bunch of note cards on my wall where I was organizing the threads and themes. And that kind of, for me at least, was like, well, you went to the trouble to make this giant mess, so let's continue working on it and organizing. And it felt in a way like a big puzzle to me, like piecing things together and alternating between, you know, moving things around and finding what fit, but also just expanding on those areas of interest, or the cabinet, or to borrow from Elissa, and just kind of delving in, where I'm dipping into it, and you know.
Speaking of puzzles, I was going to ask you both about sharks before we get to the Q&A, because I know, Elissa, you had a bigger section about the shark girl from the Cowlitz story, that I don't think you cut that section, didn't you, for this final draft? But
That's still, so the whole Cowlitz story is still in it, but the whole essay about Shark Girl, there are a few pieces that we moved elsewhere, but the entire chapter essay is not in there anymore. So a lot of my shark facts are gone. And as I was telling Gina earlier before we went live, like it was so interesting to read her shark facts, and they were shark facts that were new to me. I can't remember the one precisely. I'm looking for it. I'll never find it. But yeah, that approach to the idea of the shark fact really resonated with me.
Was it the bite? Was it the weight of the bite? That was a new shark fact for me.
Oh, the Joy, yeah. So Joy Williams I allude to a Joy Williams essay called Sharks and Suicide. And she's talking about like the pressure, like the pressure of a bite as compared to the size of the shark jaw, which is just kind of unreal when you think about it. But I fell into a shark hole and just kind of started. They're fascinating, like, but they're so, I think for me, like, you know, it's that fear of the water, fear of the unknown, and that vastness, but also that there is something kind of vulnerable about sharks in a sense, because they don't have like what's called a nictitating membrane, or I think it's great whites don't, so they roll back their eyes.
That was it.
They're getting prey, because they have to roll the eyes back so that they don't get scratched or clawed by prey that might be like struggling against them. So it's kind of interesting to think of like these giant predator animals like rolling back their eyes in defense. Like it's so strange to think of a shark needing a defense mechanism, and yet They do, and they have one, and they do this really scary thing with their eyes, which is like, they roll them back. Not all, some of them do, I think, have the membrane, but great whites, they don't. So they do that scary eye thing, which, yeah, gets a nice little nod in Jaws, which.
I'm so glad we hit on sharks. I'm going to take a couple of the questions from the Q&A for you because I know one of them is about the poetry overlap, and so this is a good moment to talk about it. But thank you so much. And if anyone else has questions about shark facts, about magic, anything, throw it in the chat. We'll take a look. Here, someone asked for Gina, how did you transition from writing prose poems to writing these vignettes as essays?
So this is a cool trick. You can actually write them as prose poems and then edit them however you want. That's my trick. Like, that's probably my favorite trick is I write as, these big, long, expansive paragraphs, and then I'll edit them down. Sometimes all I leave is a sentence, or I'll take a couple, lines from a paragraph and like move it somewhere else. But I think for me, like, I'm always thinking in that prose poetry mindset of trying to create a full world within the scope of a paragraph. And I liked that idea that some of these could like stand on their own, like a couple paragraphs at a time. One paragraph at a time could be its own thing. Like, I liked this idea of a book where people could open it up and maybe find a resonant paragraph or two and then put it away. I love books like that. Like, I love pulling books like that off my shelf and coming back to them. So I think in some ways it was wanting to create one of those that maybe people could come back to.
That's a great answer. You also talked a lot about letting these pieces marinate for you, and I feel like the breathing room on your page just leaves a lot of space for the reader to process it in that way.
And to come to it, yeah, thank you.
Let's see. Someone said, I love the idea of you're thinking of your work as a cabinet. Is it hard to arrange the cabinet, as it were? Either one of you want to talk about cabinets of curiosities?
Again, let me look at the table of contents. So my first experience of arranging a book with my body as a book of rules was hellish. It was so hard because I wrote those essays separately. Most of them I wrote during my MFA program, and I was very much in like MFA mindset of like a certain number of words that you turn in for your workshop and everything. So, and then I had to like assemble them all. So I know that the entire time I was working on this, I was very much thinking about like, I just think in essays. I don't think I could do anything that's a whole book that's, not a bunch of essays separately, but like is all kind of uniform in structure. I just can't conceive of it that way, of narrative that way. But I did know the whole time, like, there's a larger thing here, and I need to always be conscious of what the overall narrative question is and what the trajectory is of me in the narrative present and the actual present, as narrator, as writer, like embarking on a journey through something and like to figure something out. So arranging everything at this point, as far as essays goes, was not hard at all. I think as far as like all of the things, the little things, my little figurines of facts in the different essays, I think there was, when I would like hit on a topic and know what an essay was like going to be about or was showing itself as being about, like, of course I would collect source material and, stuff would come up. People would tell me things, facts and sources and whatever, and I would collect those things. But really, I just made sure that every essay was driven by like an associative logic. That was, the narrative was me trying to answer a question, trying to figure something out and get to the end of the essay. And just doing that by going from idea to idea and folding in the information as it came.
Mm. Elissa, your book feels so cohesive to me. It's hard for me to imagine that you could only, not that essays are lesser and it's only a book of essays or something rather than a longer work, but there's something about the way that your brain works through all of the pieces in this and the way that they're in conversation with each other that feels incredibly like a big, successful book.
I think that there's, like, I just wanted to really throw out any ideas about what the essay collection is or should be that we're limiting, the idea of standalone essays. And, why not, like, sure, these are chapters or they are essays, whatever, like, why not just have a lot of, different textures and different shapes, it's like a quilt or something with different patterns, each panel. I think that there's lots of room for that to be completely possible within, readers' expectations of narrative. There's just some maybe marketing distinctions that have pushed themselves into being, like aesthetic givens, maybe.
We're going to take another one from the audience. In addition to playing with structure, both of your books play with a wide array of references, objects, and images. When you're writing, do you find it difficult to give yourself permission to play with these references in your head?
I kind of feel like I was very resistant to this early on. Like, it was a big part of why I started writing the first essay that I wrote toward the book. But I think initially, like, this idea of sticking with, juggling movies and cultural ephemera, I think at the time I was considering, like, is this enduring? Is it, there's that word evergreen, does it last? I think there's a lot of conversation about, do we write about the internet or things like that? And I used to be like, oh, we're not supposed to do that. And I'm like, well, why not? This is such a part of our lives. These references, they're a big part of my life. The internet is a big part of my life. So it's like, why not write to these things that do consume our time and our attention? And I think initially it was really hard to give myself permission because for some reason I had it in my head that this was like less than, I think particularly because I was writing about horror, which is historically a genre that like was not really respected. I think even still I could encounter people who might say like, that's a little freaky or something like that. And I there's the part of me I think that wanted to be like, it doesn't have to be that way though. You can make it something beautiful and moving and touching, and you can hone in on the things that really resonate for you and show that to a reader. So initially it was a hurdle, but I think eventually when I ran with it and amplified it and took it to a really extensive degree, that's always my answer, is take the thing that like feels like, well, I shouldn't do this, and then do it really, really big, and stay with it. Do the thing that people say you shouldn't do on Twitter, I think is a good answer.
Always. I do find it really hard to give myself permission to, play with all of the reference stuff, especially. I mean, I can speak to that especially because I'm in that process now. Like, writing about something that is researched for personal essay is such a particular challenge for me because I don't need to be comprehensive as far as like, writing a book about like the history of the 2008 financial crisis. Like, those books are already out there. That's not what I'm doing, but I need to know enough so that I'm like not saying something that's like completely nonsensical and like, out of left field. I need to be somewhat accurate in understanding like, what swaps are. I don't know. But there's just so much. Once I start researching, there is so much out there that could go in. and I have to not only figure out, well, I have to both figure out the logic, like the system of logic that determines what goes in and what doesn't, and then I have to adhere to that, and I have to go through all this stuff, and have to read all these things about the stock market or whatever, and so it's really daunting, and I find myself having a hard time getting started on these projects because it just seems so big. That was certainly the case with White Magic. It's the case for everything I've written that's, involved that kind of research, like just having to go outside of what I know and bring in stuff from like other disciplines or, whatever areas of knowledge I'm unfamiliar with, but fascinated by. There's still like, I still need to work on making sure I get it right, even though it's a personal essay, because I will be fact checked, as we've discussed.
That leads well into this other question, but somebody asked for more shark facts first, which is great. Thank you, audience member. But seriously, they say, are there any other research black holes you've fallen into recently? Do you want to talk about your recent research?
Yeah, I can't remember which shark facts I cut from the book. I'll have to like repackage them. I'll have to write a different essay about sharks. I don't remember. Isn't it a fact that great white sharks go somewhere for a while, and like we don't know where they go? Nobody knows where they go.
That's kind of scary. They go to the Sharknado. No, I mean that's not a fact, but that's my theory.
It's like a shark, like Burning Man for sharks. There's this area in the sea. The sharks. These are not facts. These
are Shark Burning Man. I love it. That'll be your reported essay on Shark Burning Man. You'll have to go to a submarine and go to Shark Burning Man. There's like, that's the next grant or something. Like, get an NEA for that.
This author, Elissa Washuta, rode the back of a shark for 10 months. See what happened next. I'm not researching sharks now. I am researching, it's the stock market and there's a lot of stuff there. But I'm interested in the narratives of the stock market, both like movie narratives like The Big Short, which is a movie I'm obsessed with. Like I love it so much. Like narratives like that and Margin Call and other movies, but then also the different narratives of like how to relate to money and how to relate to stocks, and like investing and trading in general, like these narratives of what a person is supposed to do. One interesting fact I found out the other day is that I don't remember when this was or who this was. I listened to an audiobook and heard this, but at some point somebody was giving, had started like giving out, not advice, but like kind of like saying in a article or a book or something that suggesting that individuals should invest in stocks. And I think like that was not cleared by the SEC. They were like, regular people should not be buying stocks. So I'm very interested in the way that narrative is like being played out right now in the stock market with like, like people taking over and doing wild stuff, like fake money with dogs on it, crashing the economy. Like this is what happens when people are told for, like the system is built for people to not be able to play around. And then people figure out, like they get an app on their phone, figure out how to play around, all hell breaks loose. So anyway, I'm interested in the narratives of the stock market right now.
Oh,
I love it. Gina, do you have any fascinations right now?
I was into butterflies and moth specimens for a little bit, like the practice of, so I guess this is like an extension of my interest in taxidermy. For a while, I was like scratching my want to be in a museum by going to the Museum of Natural History, like the Google Earth, and just like wandering, looking at taxidermy, because I couldn't like go to New York City and visit the taxidermy bear and all those. So I was briefly like this spring falling into reading about like the practices of butterfly harvesting and butterfly farming, and how insect specimens are acquired. They're on the wall opposite me, but I have a couple butterfly and moth specimens, and I was like, where do they come from? And I was kind of like a little suspicious, like that I thought about it like after the fact, like they've been hanging there for how long. So I was diving into that just to check it out and see. But there are aspects of it that are sustainable, like it's a sustainability effort in some contexts, not all. But I was just curious about the ethics of, you know, these butterflies that are framed on my wall.
That's right. Ben, feel free to jump in if you need to cut us off. I know we can't keep everybody all night.
So I do have to cut you off, but thank you so much. I'm glad we could end on the note of butterflies, as always. But thank you once again for this fantastic conversation, and thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about these incredible books and purchase Night Rooms and White Magic at harvard.com. I've put the links to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. All right, thanks again for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Now that you're done with tour, I hope you go to Shark Burning Man.
Yes.
That's where we're all headed after this. Yeah. All right.
Here's my ride.
The after party. All right. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks so much.